Hottest topic, the performance of Lambda function, which involves cold and warm start time. So before we talk about how to improve the performance of a Lambda function, let's try to understand what is the meaning of cold and warm start. When a Lambda function gets invoked, there are certain steps happen behind the scene. First thing happens is that it will download the code and the dependencies which you have uploaded into the S3. Then it will create a container and do the initial setup of the container, which is the AWS container. Then it will initialize and start the code. And the last task will be code logic execution. Now the time it took from downloading the code to initialize and start your code is called cold start time. Why it is known as a cold start time is that when the next invocation happens for the Lambda, this cold start time will be almost zero because your container is already live, which is already done downloading your code, set up the container, and code has been already initialized and started. The only part will execute is your actual logic execution, which is known as warm start time. So the cold start time is a significant amount of time which takes for any Lambda functions to invoke, and that's the reason you will see tons of blogs talking about how you can reduce the cold start time, why it takes so much of time. So in this topic, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some of the tips which can help you to reduce your cold start time as well as warm start time. The first thing I learned is that we should be using more interpreted languages than the compiled languages for Lambda functions or for any kind of functions you are doing, because interpreted languages like Node.js and Python, they are very fast in terms of initializing and starting the code compared to the compiled languages like Java or C++, and the dependencies are very heavy in those languages. Okay, now let's suppose if you have to use Java only, and you most common framework in Java is Spring Boot, which developers use for building any application, right? So in Lambda function also they started using the Spring Boot MVC for dependency injection and started using to deploy that code as a function. But you need to understand that Spring Boot takes a lot of time to start the application. And so that's the reason Spring has come up with some other library called Spring Cloud Function, which is designed to create the lightweighted deployable, and that reduces the heavy weight of MVC dependencies like uh, web starter, test starter, and all those stuff. So even if you ended up using the Java, I would suggest you to use the Spring Cloud Function for your function development. Next part would be um, most in most cases you should be running your Lambda on default environment. We have discussed about it in earlier topic also, um, but it here I am talking about in the performance terms. As we discussed that when setting up the Lambda in VPC, you would need to set up the ENI for having the communication between the Lambda and other AWS resources, and ENI would also use the IP addresses, private IP addresses to have a communication. Now, setting up the ENI will take minimum 10 milliseconds. So if you use many ENIs, then it will add the execution time for the cold start for setting up the ENIs. So you should avoid using the VPC until and unless you need to access the resources which are running only in the VPC. Another way of reducing your downloading time for your code as well as your dependencies is that only put the required dependencies which are needed at the runtime as part of your package. When you write your function, try to identify the objects which are going to be long processing or the objects which are required to have a DB connection or the static variables which can be put in global scope and define them outside of the Lambda function so that in the next invocation of the function they can still have the values loaded and no need to reinitialize those objects. That way you can reduce the time of your code starting. Okay, so the third step which we talked about, initializing your code and starting your code, will have a reduced time if you use this practice. Next one is if you're using the Java, um, try to use the lighter dependency injections. Don't go with the Spring framework only, they are very heavy. So you can try out the Dagger or Guys. The next suggestion would be if you're using Node.js, try to reduce the size of your function because Node.js has come up with the recent upgrade of V8 optimizer which will make your function as an inline function. To understand high level what inline function does, it speeds up your code execution. Try to reduce your code size to the 600 character only. Next one is about minification and uglification. These are the terms generally used in UI web-based applications where we try to reduce the size of your static files, especially the JS and GS files, because that helps to load it faster on the browser. But now this particular feature has been more used in Lambda also, in function-based programming also, because if you are using the Java-based application language, Java-based programming languages like Node.js. So what minification basically does is it removes all the spaces and new line characters and comments. So it will reduce the size of your code. Then if you are using the uglification, what it does is it will reduce the variable name length or obfuscates them. So let's suppose if you have a variable name calling big array, it will reduce it to the variable name as a. Okay, so it will reduce the size of your variable name, and if you do it for all your variables objects, simplify them with the smaller name, then it will reduce the size of your code. So just let's see a simple example how it helps us to reduce the size of the code. So if you look at the simple this code, it has around 11 lines of code, right? Now if I use the minification, it will become a 2 lines of code. So it has reduced drastically the size of your code, size of your file code. It will help you to download it faster, uh, heavily. Then if I apply the uglification, now if you see the variables have been simplified and make it more smaller. So in one line of code only I can execute the same logic. So that is the way you can reduce the size of your file, reduce the size of your code. The next suggestion I would have is that in all the blogs, in all the documentations, you'll see around that AWS provides the AWS SDK library already loaded for the JavaScript. right? So if you're using the Node.js as a developing language for function, then AWS SDK is already available. You don't need to put it as a dependency in your code. But that is actually a good thing in terms of performance. But there is a catch. The catch is that if there is any upgrade happen to this library, AWS will be upgrading it, and then you will be automatically using the latest library released by AWS with all the latest patches, and this might break your code if your code is not able to handle the latest version of this library. So it's always better to have your own dependency management, putting AWS SDK also as part of your dependency, even though it will impact your performance, but that is a good practice to handle it yourself. These are the ways you can improve the cold and warm startup time.